You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
It is a real joy for us to welcome you all here. Habemus Papam.
Rebuilding Catholic culture, restoring Catholic tradition.
Hello and welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, episode number 62. I'm Steve Skojak. Well, we're multiple weeks now into pandemic mode. Thought about trying to do some kind of like a survival video out in the desert, post-apocalyptic. It sounded like a lot of work, though, that I didn't really want to do. We're all kind of tired, I think, exhausted maybe by too much information about this thing, because it's dominated every aspect of our lives. It's dominated our work lives, our social lives. It's dominated our spiritual lives, obviously. A lot of people haven't darkened the doorstep of a church in a few weeks, which is weird. It's Lent, it's Holy Week, and it really kind of throws you out of the Lenten narrative when you're not having that spiritual connection. But at the same time, you know, we're watching the numbers and they keep going up. And the White House here in the United States, I know not everybody watching and listening is here in America, but most of you are. And the White House is telling us, hey, listen, right now, in the next week is when it's going to hit peak in most of the places where it's at its worst right now. There's some indications that it may have already peaked in New York. It's looking like Michigan and Louisiana may be peaking soon in terms of the total number of cases. That doesn't mean... or not total numbers of cases, but, you know, hospitalizations and things like that. There's a curve that's going to start to hopefully come down a little bit. People have been staying at home. Louisiana, Michigan, same thing. I live in the Southwest. It's different here. We're behind. Let's talk a little bit about numbers. Something that I've been doing is making a note of where we are on the numbers each time I record one of these episodes. Because, you know, when you're looking at these maps that update every day, they show... you know, you're real time and it kind of creeps up. But it's interesting to look back and say, a week ago, where were we? And so every time I've done one of these update podcasts, I've started with that. And I went back and looked at what I said in my last couple. And it's actually kind of crazy how far things have progressed. So the first coronavirus update that I did was March 16th. And that was 182,490 cases. This is around the world. And 7,161 deaths. Okay, so that was Monday, March 16th. About a week later, Tuesday, March 24th, we're at 408,914 cases and 18,261 deaths. A little more than double in a week. Last week, I skipped. I didn't do an update. I gave everybody a breather, including myself. And then... today, total confirmed cases 1,475,976 as of this recording. It is currently 12:37 p.m. Mountain Time on April 8th, 2020. Total number of deaths, 86,979. Now, of course, we need to include the caveat here that the 86,000 includes the 3,200 that were reported from China, which is an absolute bullcrap number. There's not a chance in heaven or on earth that China only had 3,200 deaths. And we know that. We know more about that now. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we're seeing roughly doubling, a little bit more than doubling each week, the number of cases and the number of deaths. And so yesterday, when I started writing the script, we were at 81,000 deaths, and now we're at 86. So 5,000 deaths just since I started writing stuff down yesterday afternoon. It's important, I think, to remember that most of these deaths have happened in the past few weeks. Remember, as of March 16th, only 7,100 deaths worldwide, including the 3,200 from China, which meant that just 3 weeks ago, there were only about 4,000 global deaths from this outside of China. It's crazy. Today, there are about 78,000. No, I have to up that now to 83,000 outside of China. And by the time this video is done being edited, of course, which will be a few hours from now, and uploaded and you start watching it, I mean, it's going to be more because everything's speeding up now that there are so many people that have it. That's how it works. The more cases there are, the faster the numbers move. So every day for the past 6 days, except one, actually, I think it's for the past 7 days, except one, we've lost over 1,000 Americans to this virus. And the one day that we didn't, it was 974. So it was pretty close. But if you look at, the U.S. death rate has been pretty brutal. We have the most cases in the world. They haven't updated this. Let me see if I can get an update because yesterday we lost the most in one day. Yeah, 1,970 deaths in the United States on April 7th. So if you go back to just the beginning of April, April 1st, 1,049 American deaths. April 2nd, 974. April 3rd, 1,045. April 4th, 1,330. April 5th, 1,165. April 6th, 1,255. And April 7th, 1,970. So, I mean, imagine, people don't like doing things like comparing this to other catastrophic events. But, I mean, I don't know the exact number. How many people, I'm going to Google it right now while I'm talking to you. How many people died on 9/11? And let's see what the number is. 2,977 American victims died on 9/11. So, the New York City death toll is already over 4,000 just in a week or two. So the number of people lost is, in a very short time, comparable to this major disaster. These aren't apples to apples comparisons. You can't make them easily. And then people start bringing up, well, heart disease kills so many people, car accidents kill so many people. Look, I understand. These numbers aren't fungible, though. You can't plug one thing into another. What's significant here is how quickly this thing has killed such a large number of people. I'm unaware of any other disease that does this. I read something yesterday that said that with yesterday's numbers, coronavirus became the number one killer in the United States yesterday for that day. Killed more people than any other cause, any other heart disease, strokes, whatever. So it's significant. Long term, there are chronic conditions that kill more people probably than this will. But those are conditions that take a long time to develop. They're not something that you're fine a week ago and now suddenly you've got this and you're gone. The rapidity of this, the intensity of this is what's made it so remarkable. And I asked my Facebook audience as I was prepping for this show, if there were other news stories people were looking at that they wanted to hear about. And the most interesting answer I think I got is one person said, I've seen no other news stories. Then again, I don't really care what else is happening. And I think that's the way a lot of people have been feeling lately is my life has been shut down because of this. So when I'm paying attention, I'm drinking from a fire hose of information. And then like for me personally, I do that a lot. And then I go find something else to distract myself with that has nothing to do with it because I don't want to think about it anymore. And then a few hours later, I come back and I start looking at my notifications on my phone and I realize a whole bunch of things have happened since the last time I've looked. So it's moving very quickly. And hopefully, hopefully it's going to burn itself out. Hopefully new treatments are going to be found effective. And it looks like there's some promising things. France just had a huge surge in deaths. They posted 1,400 in a single day, which was the biggest single death day in the world from COVID anywhere until the United States hit that yesterday, that 1970 number. Testing is an interesting part of the situation here. One of the reasons why the United States has shot to the top of the charts in terms of how many cases we have is because of how many people we've tested. So again, I wrote my script yesterday, and that means it's probably a little bit out of date. But as of my writing yesterday, we had tested 2,054,000 Americans, only 2 million, population of 329 million. Of that number, however, only 392,594 tested positive. So roughly 400,000 out of 2 million, which is about 19% positive rate. Now, that matters because only if this thing has spread a lot further than we currently know based on documented cases and has affected a whole bunch of people less severely, people who didn't come in, didn't get tested, had it, got over it, have it now, are thinking that they have the flu and not something serious. If that number of people, the total number of people that have this thing is higher significantly than we think it is, then the mortality rate comes down because it's less of a percentage of that total number. Number of people dying, divided into a much larger pool of people, it brings that rate down and helps us to have kind of a grasp on how serious and how lethal this thing is. The problem is these tests are coming back negative. 80% of these tests are coming back negative, the people who are getting tested. So these are people who have symptoms. Many of them are probably hypochondriacs, whatever. But they're people who are coming in because they feel like they need to get tested, right? Many of them. And yet they don't have it. And so the question becomes, is it going to spread more and keep spreading? And this is going to get drawn out over a long period of time because a lot of people haven't gotten it yet. Or is it out there? So clearly we need to continue to expand testing. We need antibody tests because when those are administered, you can find out if people have had it already, developed antibodies and got better. And maybe if that's the case, then those people can go back to work if they've developed immunity. Millions of people are filing jobless claims. The last number I saw was almost 7 million jobless claims filed in the United States. That's going to go up. Businesses are going under. But here's the thing. That's bad. It's really bad. The economic repercussions of this are going to be devastating, I think. However, there are countries like Japan and Sweden that didn't take the severe lockdown measures that have been happening in the United States, and they're facing something similar. Sweden is being reported to be facing an economic crisis that is on par or worse with 2008. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe just signed off on a $1 trillion relief package for the people of that country. And interestingly, Japan has not levied any restrictions. They've advised people to work from home. Apparently 80% of Japanese workers are still commuting and going to work, and everything is normal. They've had a bizarrely low number of cases there, which people are trying to figure out, like what's their trick, what's their secret. But it's still, the world economy is so interconnected. This thing is damaging their economy to the point where, a country that's less than half the size of the United States in terms of population has half the relief aid package. The U.S. did a $2 trillion package. Japan's doing a $1 trillion package. So it doesn't seem like there's any way to avoid the economic consequences of this. Meanwhile, more and more information is emerging indicating that China lied bigly, badly, as Trump would say. U.S. intelligence reports out of China this past week indicate that the numbers there were much higher than reported. Radio Free Asia reported that the city of Wuhan alone appears to have had more than 40,000 people cremated in recent weeks. Now, Wuhan is the epicenter of this virus as far as anybody knows. It's a city of 11 million people, so it's about half the population of New York City. And they're reporting based on circumstantial evidence that it looks as though 40 to 50,000 people may have died there in the past few weeks, not, this 3,200 number that's being reported. Stephen Mosier, who is a China expert and Catholic author, he wrote A Mother's Ordeal. He's written books about China's hegemony and its role in the world. And he's also the head of the Population Research Institute in Virginia. He came to roughly the same conclusion in an article for LifeSite News this week. He said that the number of cremations, the number of urns being handed out to families, are all indicating a higher death toll than China has admitted. And according to Mosier, the communist authorities are bribing families not to make noise about their loved ones dying, trying to get all the mourning done by a certain Chinese holiday where they traditionally go and clean up the tombs. Mosher reminds us that the Chinese government said only one person died in the Tiananmen Square massacre when we know that the real number was about 10,000. And they also deny how many people they killed in the Great Leap Forward. For those keeping score at home, it was somewhere in the 40 million range, maybe more. In a story today yesterday from Breitbart, we are also hearing the repetition of some rumors that circulated via video weeks ago of some truly horrific things happening in China. Now, if you are active at all on social media, Twitter, Facebook, these videos were making the rounds. I saw them. I don't remember exactly when. And it was locals in Wuhan talking about how they heard screams coming from the crematorium furnaces. And some hospital workers saying, and also patients who went to the hospital saying they saw sick but still living people being put into body bags. A lot of you may remember these videos of Chinese people in absolute panic. There were videos of people who were being rounded up by medical officials, in like hazmat suits, and the people are wearing masks and they're trying to put them into these hospital vans, and the people are grabbing on to anything they can and kicking and fighting and screaming because they don't want to be put in the vans. And everybody's like, if you're just going for treatment, what's the deal? Well, maybe they knew something that we didn't about what was happening to people. We're probably never going to get to the bottom of what really went on in Wuhan. We've all seen bits and pieces of this story filtered through a very totalitarian government. Much of this stuff is coming through the internet. It's coming in Chinese. So unless you speak the language fluently, it's difficult to really fully understand the context. Some of the videos that are coming out aren't dated. So there's a lot of questions. But we have U.S. intelligence saying, no, it looks like in Wuhan, there were a lot more people that died. They've got the crematoriums going 24/7. The funeral homes are buying thousands of urns. I saw a story a week ago about how China just ordered 200,000 body bags from Taiwan. I mean, who knows? Who really knows what the scope of this thing has been in China? But the idea that China had fewer cases and fewer deaths than Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and the United States when the virus originated there, and they have a population density that is off the charts, low hygiene, people living often in third world conditions. There is no way, even with the most draconian measures that they have been implementing, welding people into their apartment buildings, no way that they have fewer cases and fewer deaths than the rest of the world. It's ludicrous. So let's zoom in a little bit to how this is affecting our daily lives. I promise, by the way, this update on the virus, we'll get to some news that's not related to the virus in a little bit. Just want to tackle this at the outset. So we are dealing with schools are still closed. My kids have been home for 5 weeks now. So if you hear them screaming in the background, everybody's tired of being cooped up in the house, and they're trying to do schoolwork at home. That's an interesting adaptation. They go to a charter school that has tried to switch to online learning. They've even sent home a laptop so that the kids can do the online class components, because we don't have enough computers for the 5 kids that we have in school. But it's challenging. And, nobody knows where to set expectations. Workloads are needing to be adjusted. There's no way, that our kids can go from having a dedicated teacher in each of the 3 younger grades that we've got at school, and then 6 or 7 dedicated teachers in the upper school, and expect the kids to be operating at the same level of efficiency as they would be if they're in the classroom. It's just not going to happen. It's chaos at home. People are running around. People are screaming. One person is always in his underpants for some reason. I don't understand. It's monkeys climbing the walls. It doesn't work the same way. And so for a lot of us, there's a lot of adaptation. Meanwhile, I'm trying to get some work done. My wife's got stuff she's got to take care of that's not just related to the kids. It's crazy. Stores are becoming more and more limited in what they can do. Here in Arizona, our lockdown has been relatively light. It's a very very libertarian kind of state. It's I always joke that we're more Texas than Texas here. We have more relaxed gun laws. We have constitutional concealed carry. We have a lot of freedom here in Arizona. It's a good place for that. And our governor has been very reticent to lock things down. So he's given a lot of latitude in his stay-at-home order. But as Arizona has been behind the curve and is starting to catch up, and as we have a very large elderly population, they need to start taking it somewhat more seriously. So they are. So stores are getting harder to get into. They're starting to limit the number of people who are allowed inside. For the first time this week, I've seen grocery store workers wearing masks and gloves. It's just moving in that direction of everything being a little bit more like a dystopian science fiction movie. And it feels weird because the sun's shining and it's warm. In fact, my office is getting way too hot right now. It's that time of year where you can't kick on the AC because it's not warm enough outside, but certain parts of the house are getting too much sun. And it feels like normal life when you look around until you go out. I went out the other night for a drive, thinking I was going to hit a store late night, and I hadn't been out in a while past 9 o'clock, and it was a ghost town. Everything was shut down. All the stores that are usually open late or 24 hours are all closed. They've all got signs on the doors. It was a strange feeling. Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the country, and it's amazing that we have as few cases as we do. Last time I looked, we were like number 20 or 21 in the United States in total number of cases, but it's a very spread out city. It's a 2,000 square mile city. A lot of landmass here, a lot of sunshine and dry air. We don't know how that affects the virus, but it may. Masks are becoming a thing again. There's this meme going around from The Princess Bride, where Fezzik asks the Dread Pirate Roberts, who we know is Wesley, why he's wearing masks. Were you burned by acid or something, he says. He says, no, it's just that they're terribly comfortable, and I think that everybody will be wearing them someday in the future. He was a prophet. But they're making a comeback, and that's kind of a problem, because they originally told us, hey, you don't need to wear masks. Now, I remember back in February, I started looking at N95 masks on Amazon when I wasn't sure yet whether I really needed to take this seriously. And they were getting expensive. I mean, I think a 6-pack was like $40 or more. And then the next time I looked, it was like $90. I mean, they were going up fast. And then they just sold out. And then I'm reading articles and stuff from the Surgeon General, and he's like, don't wear masks. They don't help. Which was BS, because they do help. They just don't help enough. And I think their primary concern was they don't have enough of them for healthcare workers, which was true. But now they're advising that we wear masks, and there aren't any available. And, I appreciate the ingenuity of these companies like MyPillow and these t-shirt companies that are making cloth masks and selling them. That's fantastic. But they're also not super effective. I mean, they're better than nothing. They block like 60% of what's in the air. But they're not, I don't know. I think it's more of a sense of false confidence. And I actually think that probably was part of what had motivated the guidance that we were being given from the government about not getting masks in the first place is if you don't wear them right, they don't work. If you don't use them correctly, they're not going to help you. So now that's a thing. And, I was joking yesterday that it's like the only time in history you can walk into a bank with a bandana on and wearing a pair of gloves and they don't think you're going to rob the place. And yes, here banks are still open. Not everywhere. Probably not for long. Churches obviously still closed. Most of us have been doing stay-at-home live stream masses for at least the past couple of weeks. Longer if we've had, people in our family who are vulnerable. So that is starting to make people really, really antsy. And I get it, but I also think we just, think about the Japanese who didn't have sacraments for 300 years. Think about the persecutions in England and in France and in the Soviet Union. I mean, we've got to be realistic and we need to be creative. We actually just published an article about this today, about how if this goes on indefinitely, we need to find creative ways to get people back into the churches. And we do. But I think in the short term, to the extent that we can find a way to offer this up and just, like nurture that longing you have to go back to Mass and appreciate it more when you can go. It can't go on indefinitely. Churches can't be deemed non-essential indefinitely. They can't. Really what we've been looking to do is buy some time. We needed to buy time to slow this thing down so the healthcare system didn't get overwhelmed so they can come up with treatments. And they are figuring this thing out, and they are coming up with treatments. We're hearing that here in the States, things are about to hit their peak in the next week or two. I think I mentioned that earlier. Europe appears to have leveled off, but there are still huge numbers of cases in Italy and Spain, France, Germany, etc. The U.S., mostly because we've been aggressive about testing, now has more cases than Italy, Spain, and France put together, which is pretty crazy. We rocketed right past them. I have a nephew who works in New York City. He called my wife recently and said it's surreal there. He said he's seen the refrigerated trucks with his own eyes that they're using as mobile morgues. And, he's in lockdown now. Some countries seem to be bucking the trend entirely. I mentioned earlier that Japan has weirdly few cases. I mean, with a population of almost 130 million people, and Tokyo is one of the most population-dense cities in the world, they only have about 3,900 cases and 92 deaths, at least as of yesterday's numbers. Crazy low. I mean, the United States is at 13,000 deaths and 400,000 cases. So nobody seems to know why. It could be related to the fact that they're just not testing everyone, so the numbers aren't being recorded. There's very stringent test protocols. You have to have a certain temperature, fever for a certain amount of time before they'll even let you test. There's like a list of symptoms that they're using. So it's possible that they are getting sick and they're dying in Japan and they're just attributing it to other things. We don't know. And that seems to be the issue here. Disparate data sets, disparate ways of measuring numbers, disparate testing procedures, meaning we're not looking at apples to apples comparisons across the world. That's not going to happen until this whole thing is in the rearview mirror. We're not going to have accurate numbers until this is behind us. There's disparity in the medical community over the virus itself. And actually, I want to talk about that, but I want to mention something else first. When I say we're not going to have accurate numbers until we look in the rearview mirror, there's an important and instructive case that we can look at from recent history, and that is the H1N1 flu that was considered a pandemic in 2009 to 2010. Now, when that pandemic was deemed to have been over in 2010, whoever the people are that count up the deaths, whether it's in the World Health Organization, they're a hot mess. They need to be disbanded. The CDC, whoever it is, I don't know who is responsible. I've read too many articles and some of the data is leaking out my ears. But whoever is responsible for counting those deaths said that 18,000 people died globally from that pandemic. That was the number in 2010. And if you were checking in back then, or if you go back and you look at the articles from mid-2010, around August, I think, is when they were tallying these numbers, and it was in the news, major news outlets, 18,000 people dead, 18 and a half. You would have walked away saying, oh, okay, well, that didn't kill that many people. And then later they went back and they said, oh, wait a minute. Let's go through all these records and let's look at all these deaths from respiratory distress and pneumonia and all this stuff. So they did, and they said, wow, there's a lot of cases out there that look like were probably H1N1, but they were misattributed to other things like seasonal influenza. And so they revised their death count significantly higher, 10 to 20 times higher, and said it was probably 200 to 500,000 people who died of H1N1 from an original estimate of 18,000. So this is something that happens with epidemiology, apparently. The numbers are really hard to nail down. The causes of death are not consistently recorded. I mean, this is something that no doubt many of you are running into articles that are skeptical about the way deaths are being recorded. There are accusations that anybody who has coronavirus, COVID-19, if they're dying, they're being recorded as a coronavirus death. Well, that's not actually necessarily the case, although there are probably places where that's happening. But if you have coronavirus and you drive your car into a tree and you die, you didn't die from coronavirus, you died from a car accident. But if you have coronavirus and you have an underlying condition like diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, whatever, and you have a cardiac event that was exacerbated by blood toxicity and by, an inability to breathe because you're having respiratory failure from coronavirus, well, if you're having a heart attack because of that, it's because of the virus that you're having the heart attack. If you're diabetic and you're managing your diabetes and you die of coronavirus, like the bus driver in Detroit that posted a Facebook video a few weeks ago saying some lady had coughed on him on the bus, and then within a week or two he was dead. He was 50. Yes, he had a comorbidity. Yes, the virus apparently exploited it. But he didn't die from the diabetes. He died, from this virus. And so it's challenging to try to understand the way they code these things. I mean, I've seen charts that showed years where they attributed 500 deaths to the flu and then thousands to the pneumonia that's caused by the flu. So is the cause of death pneumonia, or is it the flu? It's like asking, well, who killed him? Was it the knife or the man who held the knife? So a lot of this is just problems of category error. It's how are we writing this stuff down? Is there multiple choice on a death form? I don't know. I've never filled one out. Never looked at one. But they are, I would hope, trying to accurately count, yes, this person had underlying conditions, but yes, they were exacerbated by being this sick, and that's why they died. Because, Mr. Johnson was managing with his heart medication. He was okay. We expected him to live another 10 years. He didn't make it. He had a cardiac event because this thing drove him to it. He was that sick. So there's going to be a lot of debate and discussion about this for a long time. And I don't think they're going to have a count on numbers for years. If you think about it, we're a month into this, right? I mean, it really ramped up. I gave you the numbers at the beginning of the podcast. March 16th, 100,000 global cases, 7,000 global deaths, including China, 4,000 without China. So it really started in March. End of February, you can find videos of people at the Trevi Fountain in Rome, and everybody was treating everything like it was normal, February 28th. It ramped up very quickly, and almost all of the deaths we're looking at are in the last month. How long is this thing going to go on? We don't know. We don't actually know how long it's going to be before we're on the other side of this. We don't know if there are going to be waves. We don't know if it's going to go away for the summer like cold and flu season does and then come back in the fall, which is also what Spanish flu did in 1918. There was an initial wave that was kind of bad, but not super bad. And then it went into remission. It came back in the fall. And that's when, it started to pile up the body count. We just don't know. We also don't know enough about the virus itself yet. There is now a rising disparity in the medical community, an argument over the nature of how the virus works. Apparently, the concern is growing that COVID, although it presents as a respiratory problem, is not in fact technically a respiratory disease, but one that attacks the ability of the body to maintain oxygen saturation in the blood. According to one doctor I watched who's working at an ER in New York, he says that he's observing that ventilators may be doing more harm than good by forcing oxygen into lungs that can't process it because the exchange of gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide isn't happening in the lungs. So ventilators are used when people can't breathe. It's a mechanical aid to breathing, but it's not that they can't get air into their lungs. Their lungs do have fluid, but it's not that they can't get any air in. It's that the O2 saturation is just not happening. Now, this is where I make the disclaimer. Maybe I should have made it at the beginning. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a biologist. So take everything I say here with a huge grain of salt, okay? I don't expect you to treat me as an expert on any of this. I'm only presenting to you the information that I am able to read and process as a moderately intelligent human being. And you've got to form your own conclusions on this. But it's interesting to see this alternative theory developing, and you're going to see a lot more of it in the coming days. Like, we're just on the cusp of this thing rising to the surface of the public conversation, but it's going to lead to new ways of thinking about how to treat the symptoms of the virus. And it relates directly to the potential efficacy of this drug that everybody's talking about, hydroxychloroquine, because that is a malaria medication, and apparently the malaria virus feeds off of hemoglobin in the blood, which is where, according to the stuff I'm reading, again, not a biologist, or what are they, phlebotomists? That's the blood draw people, right? I'm not that either. But apparently, because malaria attacks the blood in a similar way to the way they're now thinking that coronavirus attacks the blood, it makes sense that the drug would have similar efficacy in stopping the virus from, doing the things that it does with the proteins on the cells and all that, where it gets into way too detailed nitty-gritty for me to get. But it's interesting because more and more anecdotal evidence is pointing to the fact that we may have treatments that are efficacious, that ventilators may actually be harmful, that if we can give people the right drugs early enough on when they present symptoms and keep the viral load from becoming too high to drop oxygen saturation, people are never going to wind up in the ICU in the first place. They're going to manage it and be out. And I've seen cases of people that I know through social media who have had relatives or parents or whatever who are vulnerable at-risk populations, but they got hydroxychloroquine early and they are fine now. Like, they didn't even wind up staying in the hospital. So it's a thing that actually happens. And, ideally, hopefully, this is a treatment that's going to make it so that even if this does come back in another wave, maybe it won't ever be that bad. The thing that I find myself thinking about a lot, though, is what is it that we're learning from this? What are we learning as we're all stuck at home, watching this train wreck 24/7? It's a weird thing. It's a weird time. I mean, it's surreal. You look outside and it looks like life is normal. If you have been fortunate enough that you haven't lost your job yet, or you're still working, or, you've been able to pay your bills so far this month, maybe you're getting a little worried. I am. But so far, you're not missing meals. You're not, things are continuing relatively as normal. You could still walk away from your computer in the evening and watch a movie with your kids, and, whatever it is that you're doing, it feels weirdly normal, but it's not. I've said before that I don't like the idea of ascribing to this the mind of God. People are out there saying, this is a chastisement. It's a chastisement for Pachamama. It's a chastisement for the corruption in the church. Maybe it is. It could be. But then you start asking about, well, why does God choose to use this method? Why does he issue a chastisement for Pachamama, but then the first person you hear about that who gets it is Alexander Shugol, who's the guy who threw the Pachamama in the Tiber? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It also doesn't make a lot of sense to issue a chastisement that doesn't bring about a chastised people at the end, a reformed people. If we're really coming out the other side of this already, if we're already starting to peak, if the world is starting to level this thing off, and in a month we're not going to have a lot of new cases and we're going to think we have a treatment, then it didn't really work in terms of us really having a wake-up call. If the scoffers are right and the numbers wind up being significantly less than the models predicted, okay, but what did we learn from this? I've taken the stance of probably the most grounded way to look at this, if you want to look at it as a chastisement, is it's a chastisement for my own sins. It is an opportunity where God's kind of lightly smacking you upside the head, or me, I need it more than you probably, and saying, okay, how about you take some time while you're sitting here and think about your relationship with me, and think about your relationship with the church and think about the things that you take for granted. Do you take for granted going to Mass? Do you take for granted the fact that you can run to confession when you mess up? And now that's not easy to do. Do you take for granted that you can receive the Eucharist regularly? What are you taking for granted? Because if you think about it, Francis was a chastisement on the church, right? I mean, he woke up a lot of people to how corrupt the Vatican bureaucracy had become. And he continues to do that. He continues to wake people up. And that's a good thing, but it's a painful thing. But that chastisement's been going on for 7 years. And we're still seeing it dredge up a realization on the part of many people of, wow, like we need to peel back these layers on the post-conciliar church and figure out how far astray we've gone from where we were supposed to be. This pandemic, it just feels too short. It feels too easy. Obviously, it's not easy for anybody who's losing a loved one or for anyone who has it themselves. But so far, the majority of people are escaping the harm from this. Maybe that's precipitous to say, because the second wave of this chastisement is going to be the economic one, and who knows? Who knows how that's going to affect us all? We don't know yet, but it could be bad. It's probably going to be very uncomfortable. And so focusing on, rather than, is God punishing the sins of the people that I don't like, who are doing the stuff I think is bad, is not where we are going to find profitability in this. It's going to be, how is this forcing me to confront stuff in myself that needs to be confronted? How am I going to be a better man, a better Catholic coming out the other side of this? Am I? Is it really just exposing me, to my own insufficiencies and sinfulness and depravities? Like, am I becoming a better person because of this, or am I becoming worse? Because I tell you what, it is not bringing out the best in all of us. I wrote about this the other day in my column, but I'm seeing people just, the amount of division that this is causing, people can't even come to an agreement about the numbers that are being reported, and there's conspiracy theories everywhere, and some people are being totally superstitious, and some people are betting everything on science and government, and there's just, it feels impossible. It feels like the Tower of Babel has been struck and we've been scattered. And people that we respected or liked suddenly become impossible to talk to because they have zero respect for your position on what we should do and how we should proceed. There's an ugliness that's coming out of this. And I'm hoping, although I'm not at all convinced, but I'm hoping that there is a remedial action that is happening here. It's like an emetic, You take an emetic because you've taken poison and you need to vomit it up. And maybe this is forcing us to vomit up some of our bad ideas and some of our, I don't know. We're so divided. We are so divided. Once again, the trad world, the traditional Catholic world, seems to be being hardest hit here because that's where the divisions are really strong. I've seen a guy flat out say he was apostatizing from the Catholic faith because he was so scandalized by the conduct of other Catholics in this pandemic. Now, that's an extreme reaction, and I think it was wrong. I think that is not something that should have been done. But at the same time, it gives you sort of a litmus test on just how hot passions are running. So I think that we have been given an opportunity to reflect, and we need to be careful about how much we distract ourselves from that opportunity. This is not one of those situations that's so apocalyptic that we're all sitting at home reading books by candlelight we're most likely continuing to distract ourselves with all the same things that we usually do. We're binge watching shows. We're, playing video games. We're overindulging in the news and in social media. We're praying less as we're watching more, because we get up in the morning and our thoughts immediately go to, what did I miss? What's happening now? Because that's what it is. When something like this happens, that's what we want to do. Our instinct is to watch, to go all in, to dive into our pet theories and interpretations. I'm assuming I'm not the odd one out here in suffering from all these temptations to distraction and into overindulgence in things that are not necessarily profitable. So I think we've all been given an opportunity here to reflect. The question is whether or not we make the most of it. I have other news to talk about, and I'll be doing that right after this. So stay safe and stay tuned. We'll be right back. Do you love OnePeterFive? Do you want to join in our fight? Go to OnePeterFive.com/donate today. Thank you for your support.
You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. I want to touch on some news stories that we're running out of time. We've only got about 15 minutes left if I'm going to try to keep this to an hour today. And I wanted to get this out, if possible, before the digest goes out today. But I think that it is important that we discuss the case of Cardinal George Pell. There's also one more story I want to touch on before we go. But let's dial in on the Cardinal Pell story. So I was going to write a news brief about it, but there's a lot of complexity here, and I don't think people necessarily realize how much complexity there is in this story. So let me just kind of walk you through what's going on here. On Monday, Cardinal Pell had his conviction for sexual abuse overturned by Australia's High Court. So that's the lead here. The court ordered that his convictions be quashed and judgments of acquittal entered in their place. So basically, he's been sitting in prison for 13 months, and they said, you know what? No, there's a problem here, and we're overturning the whole thing. Grounds for acquittal, according to the court, was that, quote, the jury, acting rationally on the whole of the evidence, ought to have entertained a doubt as to the applicant's guilt with respect to each of the offenses for which he was convicted. Now, I don't know a lot about how the Australian justice system works. I don't know if I can assume that all the same principles are in play, but remember, in the U.S. justice system, the maxim is beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the rule for finding someone guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt. The Australian court is saying they should have entertained a doubt about the applicant's guilt based on what they knew. And I think it was obvious to pretty much everybody viewing the case objectively that Pell was facing a sham trial. He had a single victim who was the only witness for the prosecution, testifying against him with no corroborating witnesses. This victim claimed there was a second victim, but that man had died long ago, and he had never accused Pell publicly in any way. And in fact, in an interview with his mother, I believe, a year or two ago, she said that he denied that anything had ever gone on there. So this guy, couldn't defend himself, couldn't speak for himself, but was brought into this trial as a second victim, according to the primary victim and witness. So this victim, alleged victim, has no corroborating witnesses. His side presented evidence to the jury that demonstrated on a purely logistical basis. Pell's side presented to the jury witnesses that demonstrated on a purely logistical basis, on a pragmatic basis, how unlikely it was that he could have committed the crimes he was accused of. Now remember, he was accused of forcing these two young boys, to commit sexual acts on him just after Mass while he was fully vested and in a public area, despite the fact that his high profile as a bishop meant he was never alone in those moments. And the accusations are, of course, decades old. They go back to the 90s. According to the court, quote, the assumption that a group of choristers, including adults, might have been so preoccupied with making their way to the robing room as to fail to notice the extraordinary sight of the Archbishop of Melbourne, dressed in his full regalia, advancing through the procession and pinning a 13-year-old boy to the wall, is a large one. This is pretty much flat-out sarcasm. They're saying this is a preposterous finding. Now, it's important to remember here that the Australian High Court rarely overturns convictions. In fact, historically, only 13%, according to one news report I read, of jury decisions have been overturned by this judicial body. And yet, in this case, they overturned the conviction unanimously. So the upshot is that Pell has spent 13 months, 405 days in prison for a crime that pretty much everybody knows he didn't commit. In fact, even his accuser is on record now saying that he accepts the court's judgment and, he's not upset about it, which is not something, that who is assaulted sexually as a 13-year-old boy seems likely to say, but whatever. So it was a travesty of justice, and it has been put right, and I think we're all in agreement on that. But let's back up a little bit. Let's go all the way back to 2015, where this strange story seems to find its origins. Now, granted, the accusations are from the 90s, but this whole trial starts in 2015, in my opinion. Pell is working, at the time, as a Vatican treasurer. He was appointed by Pope Francis. He is a member of the Pope's C9, his Council of Cardinal Advisors, and he is put in charge of investigating and reforming Vatican finances. In the process, Pell discovers over €1 billion hidden from the books on the Vatican Bank. Now, here's a quote from an article in the Australian at the time. The vast sums of undeclared money have been hidden in various bank accounts by organizations and groups within the Holy See in Rome. The funds have not been misused and are not part of corruption and scandal that have previously shamed the Vatican. I don't understand this assertion. But the money has not been properly disclosed or available for the full use of the Vatican because it has been hidden away in an Italian practice of keeping aside undeclared funds. I like how setting aside €1 billion off the books is just hand-waved away as just an Italian practice. No reason to worry about it. I mean, we're just a colony of criminals down here in Australia. That's all. We don't really mind. Fair dinkum. Yes, I know. You were waiting for it, weren't you, the whole time? The vast sums of undeclared money have been hidden in various bank accounts by organizations and groups within the Holy See in Rome. But Pell found something powerful people in the Vatican didn't want him to see. He wasn't the first. The former head of the Vatican Bank, Ettore Tedeschi, ran into problems as well. He was ousted after trying to do his job, even though Pope Benedict, was supposed to have brought him back in. Never happened. Then Libero Maloney, who was hired to be Auditor General of the Vatican in 2015, also resigned after his computer was hacked. He was threatened with arrest, and he was later criminally charged. The case was dropped in 2018. Maloney says he didn't quit voluntarily. He was forced to sign a prepared resignation letter. Evidently, he said, they didn't want me to report some things I'd seen. I couldn't find the article today. This was, again, a few years ago that this became relevant. But if I'm not mistaken, Maloney actually was fearing for his life. He wasn't sure whether or not he was going to survive the situation because, again, discovering financial misdeeds is a dangerous thing in Italy. So don't quote me on that because I can't find it, but boy, I swear I remember reading that in one of the articles. So Pell, who finds big money hidden in the Vatican mattresses, so to speak, and who ticks off the Pope by signing the 13 Cardinals letter expressing concern over his conduct at the Family Synod, winds up suddenly facing decades-old charges in Australia and has to go home and face trial, in which he is speedily convicted despite there's no forensic evidence whatsoever. No corroborating witnesses, nada. So it's wildly suspicious. I noted it at the time, as did a number of other commentators. Libero Maloney, who was in a better position than most, I think, to be suspicious, made a public comment about it at that time in the media, saying that it very well may not have been a coincidence that Pell found himself facing charges. Now, it's important to note a key figure here. Cardinal Angelo Becciu. Becciu, who shows up time and time again as a papal hatchet man. Becciu, who was directly involved in the ouster of Malone. Becciu, who personally intervened to stop Pell's investigation into the Vatican finances. Becciu, who wound up being the papal representative to the Knights of Malta after the coup that knocked out their leadership at a moment when they were figuring out how to handle a 30 million Swiss franc bequest, money that seems to have been at the heart of that entire escapade. When there is some kind of dirty money dealing on the line in the Vatican, all you have to say is Becciu, 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 and he appears, like Beetlejuice. Marco Cesati put it well. He said that the word in Rome was that the cannons, not the religious cannons, but the sort that fire large ballistic projectiles, were in Australia, but the cannonballs were made in the Vatican. In other words, Australia had a reason they wanted to take down Pell, but the Vatican gave them the ammunition, or so the rumor goes. Why did Australia hate Pell? A number of reasons. He was very conservative, as Australian clergy go. He was a force to be reckoned with. Pell is notably a former rugby player with a bit of a temper who, has been alleged to pound his fists on tables when he wants something done. He's a big dude. And people are intimidated by him. He opposed the LGBT agenda in Australia. He's pro-life. But this is where things get murkier, and where I step in to caution everyone who is rightfully pleased with the High Court's decision not to automatically turn this into an opportunity to hero worship Pell, which in some quarters is happening already because, as I have lamented frequently of late, Catholic tribalism seems to be outpacing Catholic thinking by a ratio of 2 or 3 to 1. It's about proving how Catholic you are. It's about identifying symbols and rallying behind them. Because all that seems to matter is jumping on the bandwagon du jour. And we need to slow the heck down. One of the reasons Australians wanted to see Pell go down, and I've seen it speculated that this may have been the reason for the sham trial, is that he was seen as emblematic of the problem of clerical sex abuse in Australia, scapegoat. But not entirely an unwarranted one. See, in 1993, as an auxiliary bishop, Pell publicly accompanied a priest named Gerald Rigsdale, an accused clerical abuser, to his first court appearance as a show of support. Now, Pell had formerly lived with Rigsdale, who went on to be convicted of 65 cases of child sex abuse. Pell, for his part, said he had no idea about Rigsdale's proclivities. In 2016, Pell gave testimony to the Royal Commission on Child Sex Abuse about things that happened during his various tenures and dioceses in Australia regarding pedophile priests. According to the Australian edition of Business Insider, this is the list of things he said he couldn't remember or didn't know about. Listen to this. Number 1, whether he was ever approached about priests being overly affectionate with kids. Number 2, whether he was approached for advice before a special tribunal was established to judge bishops accused of covering up priests who sexually abused children. Number 3, whether pedophile priest Paul David Ryan was sent to the United States for special treatment for his sexual offenses. Number 4, whether he knew anything about Paul David Ryan's U.S. trip at all. Number 5, whether Bishop Ronald Mulkerns from Ballarat was aware of child abuse within his diocese. Number 6, where the Corpus Christi Seminary is located, where Pell was once a leader. Number 7, whether he was aware of allegations against Stephen Farrell. Number 8, whether he ever met Monsignor John Day, a now convicted pedophile. Number 9, whether he heard even gossip around Monsignor Day's actions. Number 10, whether Mildura assistant priest Dan Torby warned him about what he had heard about Monsignor Day. Number 11, whether he knew about Monsignor Day taking young boys out on trips with him. Number 12, whether he knew about Monsignor Day receiving another job in another parish. And number 13, when he first knew about the offenses committed by a man known as Brother BWX. Now, I don't know the intimacies of all of those cases. I don't know the details around all of those names. But if those questions were being asked of Pell, who was a bishop and a man of importance in several dioceses throughout Australia over the many years that he's been there, one would think some of those things might be in his memory somewhere, because there are no indications of senility. So I want you, if you're getting irritated with me, to stop and think for a minute about two things. One is Cardinal Farrell. Cardinal Farrell worked for Father Maciel, was a driver for him, if I'm not mistaken. He also lived with Teddy McCarrick for 6 years. When Farrell said that he knew nothing about the double lives of either of those monsters, who believed him? Farrell was never himself accused of anything, but his credibility was ravaged for claiming ignorance of something that should have been obvious to him, as, frankly, it should have been. Pell lived with Rigsdale. Pell was in a position to know about these other pedophile priests that he was asked about. He says he doesn't remember, that he didn't know. It's a similar story. What about Francis, who was warned by Archbishop Vigano about McCarrick, and now he pretends like he has no idea? Do we believe these stories or don't we? And if we do, when do we believe them? What does the character of the man have to be in order for us to say there's something suspicious going on here? Do we really have a different standard for Pell simply because he was falsely accused of something else and has been good on some things? Now, Dr. John Lamont, who has written for OnePeterFive and was a leading force in the filial correction of Pope Francis, so not a liberal, used to work for Pell. He has stated publicly on a number of occasions that he believes that Pell was involved during his career in systematic cover-up of pedophilia in the Australian church. Joseph Schambra, who I've interviewed several times, whose apostolate concerns evangelizing homosexuals, many of whom have been abused, at times also by clergy, has expressed similar concerns about the fact that Pell continued to rise through the ranks, even though he appeared in a show of public support with a priest who wound up being convicted of 65 counts of child sexual abuse, a priest who he lived with. I'm not here to put Pell on trial again. It's not my job. Justice was done in Australia this week, as far as I'm concerned. He should have been acquitted. The conviction should have been overturned. I'm glad that he's free. He was convicted for something almost nobody believes that he actually did, in a way that made a mockery of the Australian justice system in a terrifying and Orwellian way. But we need to learn to temper our enthusiasm for the man, because human beings are complex. It's possible for a man to be innocent of some things, to do real good, and still be guilty of other things that are evil. We are so desperate right now for strong Catholic leaders that sometimes I think it makes us vulnerable to being a bit naive about following anyone who looks like he's got some spine, and Pell certainly has that. Sadly, spine alone isn't enough. It's just a starting point. So we need to consider this because people are ready to throw parades. People are advocating that we televise the first mass of Cardinal Pell. I saw some person say maybe he should be elected to be the next pope. Slow your roll, people. I hope that the time Pell has spent in prison has given him cause to reflect. I hope, like Archbishop Vigano, he's going to step forward and say, you know what? I'm an old man facing judgment soon, and there's some things I want to come clean about. That would be fantastic. However, there is reasonable suspicion that he was involved in covering things up that he shouldn't have been. And those are problems that, as far as I know, he's never been exonerated of. So, pray for him. Be grateful that justice was served, but keep your heads. Finally today, I'm just going to report it briefly since we're quickly running out of time. Pope Francis has convened a new commission with entirely new members to investigate, once again, the female diaconate. Because if you don't get an answer you like the first time, try again. As I stated, along with Tim Gordon back in February when Querida Amazonia came out, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation for the Amazon Synod, just because the exhortation didn't mention explicitly women deacons does not mean that it's off the table, particularly because the exhortation referenced and recommended the text of the Synod final document, which did discuss it. A lot of people, for some reason, thought that just because it wasn't explicitly discussed that it had been shoved back in the freezer, and it hasn't gone away. In fact, this commission is at the Pope's request. Now, we don't know what's going to come of this. We don't know how it's going to be developed. I haven't had time to do a deep dive into the members of the commission to find out if they're the kind of people who are likely to say yes or likely to say no. Francis is usually not too keen on definitive answers. He likes opening doors and letting everybody kind of wander through them at their own pace. So I would be surprised to see them seeking out a definitive no, but it's possible. So we'll keep an eye on that story as it goes. I want to remind you, now that we are completely out of time, overtime, for extra information about today's stories, because there's a lot packed in here. As always, please look at our full website post for related links in the show notes. I'm going to mostly focus on links related to the Cardinal Pell stuff and everything. You can look up coronavirus stuff on your own. It's not like there aren't a million articles a day being published about that. I ask, as always, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, hit the little bell icon, share it with your friends. If you're coming to us via iTunes or some other podcast service, please subscribe there. And if possible, leave us a review. It helps other people to find our work. And as always, if you would like to support our work with a modest financial contribution, please do so at OnePeterFive.com/donate. Until next time, I'm Steve Skojak. Thank you for tuning in to the OnePeterFive podcast. God bless you.